Welcome to The Explainer. If you've ever wondered why finding an affordable home in America feels so incredibly difficult, well, the answer isn't just about today's market. It's actually buried in our history. So today, we're going to dig into how four massive national crises literally forged the housing policies that shape where and how we all live. Okay, let's just dive right in. That feeling of sticker shock when you see a home price, or that monthly struggle to make rent, that is not a new problem. It's really the end result of a long and pretty dramatic history. You see, the system we have today wasn't neatly designed in some quiet conference room. Nope, it was forged in the fire of economic collapse, world war, and social revolution. So here's how we're going to trace that story. We'll move through four critical moments, from the absolute desperation of the Great Depression, through the post-World War II housing boom, right into the fire of the 1960s urban crisis, and then finally, we'll look at the massive policy rethink that came right after. Each one of these crises forced a new answer to a really fundamental question. Who gets a home in America, and how? All right, our story kicks off in the 1930s. Now, before this, the federal government really had very little to do with housing. It just wasn't its business. But when the economy completely imploded, it created a disaster so vast that Washington, well, it had no choice but to step in. Just try to let that number sink in for a second. Every single day, 1,000 families were put out on the street. With unemployment just ravaging the country, the private housing market didn't just slow down, it completely seized up. I mean, by 1933, it's estimated that half of all home loans in cities were delinquent. This wasn't just a problem, it was an absolute national catastrophe. So this is where it gets really fascinating. The government's response, it moved in two completely opposite directions at the very same time. On one side, you've got the FHA, which was a program designed to save the private real estate and banking industries by insuring mortgages. But on the other side, you have public housing, an idea that wasn't born inside government at all. It was actually pushed hard by activists who were arguing that the free market was never going to solve the crisis of urban slums on its own. And that push led to this. This act set a powerful and, it turns out, lasting precedent. For the very first time, it became official federal policy that the government had a direct responsibility to build homes for its poorest citizens. At the time, this was a really radical idea, and it only became reality because of a masterful political campaign by activists and their allies in Congress. Okay, let's jump forward to the next crisis and see how this all builds. World War II ends, the soldiers come home as heroes, but they return to a country with almost nowhere for them to live. The fight for a home for them was just beginning. Just think about that. After years of the Depression and then the war, practically no new homes had been built. Now, all of a sudden, 12 million service members are coming home, ready to get married, ready to start families. People were absolutely desperate, cramming in with relatives or living in trailers, cellars, even in public parks. The country was facing a housing emergency on an epic scale. And this contrast, it highlights a core tension you see again and again in American policy. The first attempt to fix this was this top-down command and control approach. The government's housing expert tried to manage the entire construction industry from Washington, and it failed spectacularly. What ultimately worked was the GI Bill, a much more decentralized strategy that used government guarantees to basically unleash the power of private builders and lenders. The housing part of the GI Bill ended up being one of the most popular and transformative programs in American history. It put homeownership within reach for millions of middle and working class veterans, and it fundamentally remade the country's landscape by fueling the explosion of the suburbs. So while the GI Bill was busy building a new, largely white suburbia, something very, very different was happening back in the cities. By the mid-1960s, a crisis of poverty, segregation, and just plain neglect was boiling over. This was the stark, unforgettable finding of the official commission President Johnson created to figure out why riots were sweeping the nation. I mean, the report was a bombshell. It pointed directly to racial discrimination and terrible housing conditions as the root causes of all the unrest. You can just feel the pressure building year after year on this timeline. Each summer brought new waves of violence, and it all culminated in these nationwide explosions of anger after Dr. King's assassination in 1968. The images of American cities on fire created this immense political pressure on Washington to do something. And the scale of the government's response was just staggering. This was the biggest housing production effort ever attempted. But notice the key difference in the approach. Instead of more public housing, the government turned to the private sector. It created these massive subsidy programs to incentivize for-profit developers to go in and rebuild the cities. But what happens when the biggest program in history runs headlong into the biggest problems? Well, this next crisis wasn't about a shortage of homes, but about a massive failure of the very policies that were designed to create them. So why did they fail? Well, within just a few years, these brand new programs were mired in scandal. There was widespread fraud, shockingly high foreclosure rates, and the costs were just sky high. And then, the televised demolition of the Pruitt-Igoe public housing complex in St. Louis became this powerful national symbol for the failure of these big, top-down government housing projects. This widespread failure led to a full-blown policy crisis. So the Nixon administration, it froze all new housing commitments and launched this massive review. And it came to a pretty radical conclusion. What if the problem wasn't a lack of housing, but a lack of income? And that question sparked a huge national experiment to test a completely new idea. This was a revolutionary shift. Instead of supply-side policies that build more houses, this was a demand-side approach. Think of it this way. Instead of giving people a specific meal, you give them money to go buy their own groceries. The government was moving from being a builder to being a rent assistant, giving families vouchers to go find their own housing on the private market. Okay, so we've traveled through 4 major crises that have completely reshaped American housing. What does all of this turbulent history tell us about the challenges that we are all facing right now? Well, looking back, a few key lessons really stand out. First, crisis is the engine of change. We saw that clear as day with the Depression. Second, determined activists can absolutely force new ideas onto the agenda, just like they did with public housing. Third, centralized control often fails where decentralized incentives like the GI Bill succeed. And finally, and this is a big one, programs that earn broad, popular support are the ones that truly last. Look, this history doesn't give us a simple blueprint for fixing today's problems. It just doesn't. But what it does do is force us to ask the right questions. Are we in a crisis right now that demands bold action? What coalitions need to be built? And what kind of approach this time will earn the popular support needed to truly, finally make a difference? This entire analysis is rooted in some excellent research from Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, which we've cited right here. Thanks so much for joining us.